I'm Mike Sachs. This is Elie Mystal, and right now we are here with the MeidasTouch Network to discuss the biggest issues coming your way for this election and beyond. None more than what we're going to hear right now, what came out of the mouth of former President Trump.
During my 4 years, nothing happened, and there was great pressure on me having to do with guns. We did nothing. We didn't yield. And once you yield a little bit, that's just the beginning. That's the avalanche begins.
Doing nothing on guns. Again, I'm Mike Sachs with Court Accountability. I'm a senior advisor there, and with me is Elie Mystal, the justice correspondent at The Nation. And we just heard Trump talking about doing nothing on guns during his last administration, which is likely a promise that he's giving to the NRA not to do anything on guns in his next administration. And of course, we have just seen another fatal school shooting in Georgia. And we had J.D. Vance, the vice presidential nominee on the Republican ticket with Trump, commenting on that.
Now, look, the Kamala Harris answer to this is to take law-abiding American citizens' guns away from them. That is what Kamala Harris wants to do. She says, look, I don't like this. I don't like to admit this. I don't like that this is a fact of life. But if you are a psycho and you want to make headlines, you realize that our schools are soft targets. And we have got to bolster security at our schools so that a person who walks through the front door We've got to bolster security so that if a psycho wants to walk through the front door and kill a bunch of children, they're not able to. And again, as a parent, do I want my kids' school to have additional security? No, of course I don't. I don't want my kids to go to school in a place where they feel like you've got to have additional security, but that is increasingly the reality that we live in.
Elie, a fact of life, increasing the reality that we live in. What's this all about?
With all due respect to J.D. Vance and the mouth breathers clapping behind him, this is not a fact of life anywhere else except for this bloodthirsty country. It's not a fact of life in Mexico. It's not a fact of life in Europe. It's not a fact of life in Australia. And Australians use beer as a performance-enhancing drug. It is only a fact of life here under oppressive Republican rule and Republican control of the courts. It is a fact of life here because of how Republican judges and justices have interpreted our most fatal amendment, the Second Amendment, to be an absolutist call to arms for all of the crazy psychos and weirdos and violent domestic abusers who wish to turn guns on innocent people. It is a fact of life here because of who we allow to rule the country here.
Now, Elie, we were talking about who rules our country, and you and I have long talked about the fact that the real rulers of this country are those 9 men and women in robes sitting on one First Street across the Capitol in Washington, D.C. But there's also many other judges beneath them who do their bidding. And they're all right now trying to do the bidding of a big Supreme Court decision from a couple of years ago, the Bruen case. And that Bruen case says that if there's no history or tradition of a certain gun regulation dating back to either when the Second Amendment was ratified in 1791 or the 14th in 1868, then that is presumptively unconstitutional.
The case that we're talking about, Mike, the Bruen case, that was the most extreme ruling the Supreme Court issued that term 2 years ago. But people missed it because it came out the day after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade and the Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health decision. But in terms of just legally changing the structure of the law, changing the interpretation of the Constitution, nothing was more extreme than the Bruen case. And the way that I can explain this to people who don't have our kind of legal educational background is pretty simple. What Clarence Thomas and the conservative majority said was that unless you can tie your modern day gun law to something that George Washington might have thought about while he was sitting on the toilet, right? Unless you have a historical doppelganger or something very close to it, from the 1700s to deal with our modern assault rifles and barrel ammunition drums and the like, then you can't have a gun law. It is not just an extremist decision, not just an insane decision, but again, a murderous one.
And Elie, under this regime,
murderous decision.
Under this legal regime, Elie, we have JD Vance talking about how that the solution then is to beef up security in schools. Be that as it may, I'm flashing back to Uvalde in Texas, where there were security guards in the deep red state in a town that wasn't known for being all that gun safety friendly. And what did the cops do? What did the security do when they were called for help at Uvalde?
Nothing. They did absolutely nothing. I mean, we got to remember, we're talking about conservatives who won't provide enough school funding so that kids can learn the trombone. All right. We're talking about Republicans who won't put paint supplies in schools, but now they want to arm teachers, public school teachers with no professional training, with handguns to do what? To get more students killed in some kind of useless crossfire while the cops cower outside waiting for the shooting to stop so they can go in and make arrests. It is an insane hardening of schools, the JD Vance position. It's an insane position. And once again, as I started, it is a position that no other industrialized country, no other wealthy country, no other sane country has had to do, because they've attacked the problem at the source, right? They're not trying to harden their schools. They're trying to keep guns out of the hands of crazy, violent people who want to harm school children. And they're very effective at it because they don't have Clarence Thomas running their gun laws.
And I want to get into the guts of this right now, who runs the gun laws, because we just heard also in reaction to the shooting in Georgia, President Biden once again get up and say we need to ban assault rifles. Vice President Harris has also made that part of her platform too. There was an assault rifle ban from the 90s into the early 2000s. It was let lapse, and we have had this epidemic of gun violence, of mass shootings, largely driven by these AR-15 type assault weapons that would be banned under such a federal law and are currently banned in several states, such as Illinois, such as Maryland, such as California. And these laws have been under attack in courts before judges that follow the lead of our current Supreme Court. If they're Republican, if they're Democratic appointed, they tend to still say, no, these laws are constitutional. And right now, coming up to the court are challenges to state assault weapons bans, specifically one from Maryland. Just a few weeks ago, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals divided down partisan lines, except for one old school judicial restraint Republican, Judge J. Harvey Wilkinson III, a Reagan guy, who wrote for all the Democrats on that court, upholding Maryland's assault weapons ban, and I believe their high capacity magazine ban as well. Lining up on the other side of the ledger of this full court, every single other Republican nominee and appointee to the Fourth Circuit, which is, in my mind, a harbinger of what's to come at the Supreme Court when this case gets there. Because I should note, Elie, that on the Supreme Court right now, not only do you have Justice Thomas, who has already called for and suggested that state assault weapons bans are unconstitutional, but also there's one Mr. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who, when he was an appeals court justice on the D.C. Circuit, voted unsuccessfully in dissent to strike down D.C.'s assault weapons ban. And to do so, he articulated this history and tradition test we were just talking about that the Supreme Court adopted a couple of years ago. He is the one who started it. He is the progenitor of that test. So we have sitting on the court now at least two, but likely probably 5 or 6 Supreme Court justices who are poised to strike down state assault weapons bans, which would all but doom, really, any federal assault weapons ban that Congress and a president, if they were all controlled by Democrats, would maybe even, perhaps if they can get past the filibuster, would pass, only to reach the Supreme Court's buzzsaw. That's the state of affairs we are in right now with assault weapons bans. But there's so much other stuff going on beneath the surface. I was just talking about Illinois that laws coming up from there. You're talking about people getting caught in the crossfire. I'm thinking about a case that just came down last week about people getting caught in the crossfire coming out of Illinois, or could get people caught in the crossfire. What's that?
Yeah, so Illinois went full Bernie Getz on their gun laws. A conservative, a Trump-appointed judge in Illinois overturned a ban on open carry weapons on the subway in Illinois. On the elevated line, right in Chicago, you now are allowed to carry your guns on the subway, according to Trump judges. And this is the kind of Escape from New York, Snake Plissken, like dark underbelly of the conservative bloodthirsty logic. Their idea, instead of trying to take away the guns from people who don't need them, is to make sure that everybody is armed and dangerous at all times so that you never know. And in their kind of like toxic masculinity argument, logic, that's the chesty way of defending yourself. You got a gun, well, I got a gun, let's shoot, and hit some 6-year-old kid on the subway, right? Hit some high school teenager trying to get to school on the subway. That is their warped logic. And that is the logic that is shared not just by this Trump-appointed judge in Illinois, it's shared by Sam Alito, who has literally made the pro-Bernie Getz argument in Supreme Court opinions that he has authored. So to roll it back into the assault weapons ban, I always think the Democrats on this are a little bit fighting the last war, right? We're kind of trying to put together a legislative response to the epidemic of gun violence that we experience in this country that no other country experiences, when what we need is a complete judicial reformist response to the epidemic of gun violence, because it is the judges who are allowing these killings to happen much more so than the politicians. I mean, people forget things like background checks and red flag laws. These are extremely popular positions. Assault weapons bans, extremely popular positions. The NRA is a small rump organization that yes, they have a lot of like outsized political influence, but they are in the significant minority in this country. The reason why the NRA is powerful, the reason why the gun lobby is powerful, is because conservative appointed judges, whether they're appointed by Trump or Bush or whoever the next person is, have in lockstep forced down our throats this most extremist and bloodthirsty version of the Second Amendment, and they strike down common sense gun laws, what few common sense gun laws we can even pass legislatively.
And we talk about originalism and history and tradition and whether these laws can be upheld, but the very idea of the Second Amendment as we know it only emerged around the 1980s. Well funded by the NRA, who were pretty much funding academics to flesh out this very idea, and make it seem as though it was always thus about the Second Amendment.
The current interpretation of the Second Amendment, that it provides an unfettered right to gun access, an unfettered right to bear arms for the purposes of personal self-defense, that is an ad campaign the NRA launched in the 1970s. Prior to the 1970s, it was completely normal for states and localities and the federal government to pass gun laws. There's the famous 1934 Gun Control Act passed by FDR that banned the Tommy gun. Why? Because mobsters were shooting people up with a Tommy gun.
And Elie, let me tell you something. A couple weeks ago, a Trump judge just declared that machine gun ban unconstitutional. Even machine guns now are seen as of right for people for self-defense. I mean, come on, it makes no sense whatsoever. But this is where we are right now. Now, I want to posit something to you, Elie. Do you think perhaps maybe, because you're talking about court reform and getting and movement towards changing the court, Roe versus Wade was really the driving factor for the right wing's move to capture and take over the court as we know it now? Do you think perhaps the Heller decision, which has lots of blood on people's hands, could be one of those galvanizing decisions that the left side of the ledger or the gun safety side of the ledger could rally behind and get a political movement behind towards some measure of court reform or judicial politics to get the court back for that side?
I wish it would. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I'm doing these videos, because I want people to understand the connection between the violence we see in our communities and what's happening on the Supreme Court. But you have to get the rest of the media on board. And like, even if you look at the coverage of this Georgia shooting, right, they're focused on the shooter. They're focused on the parent who gave the 14-year-old the gun, despite needing the fact the 14-year-old was obviously in need of mental health services. And they focus on the lax gun laws in Georgia, which again speaks to a legislative response to the problem as opposed to a judicial one. I don't think that the public writ large understand just how bloodthirsty and extremist the conservative judges are on this issue. I don't think the general public understands what we're up against. So my close and my call and my plea is not thoughts and prayers. It is reform the courts. Because until you wrest control of the courts, both the Supreme Court and the lower courts, from Republicans, until you take back control of the courts, the killings in our classrooms will continue.
Yeah, that's a great way to end it, Elie. And those reforms are meant to enable we, the people, to be able to speak for ourselves and decide what kinds of gun laws we want, what kinds of any kind of laws we want that will follow the will of the majority of the people here in this country. Subject, of course, only to not being a bigot. among other things. So, Elie, I want to thank you very much for joining. This has been excellent. And you and I are going to be doing this every week for MeidasTouch. I'm looking forward to it. And we'll probably end up talking about that court reform stuff once or maybe lots of times coming up. But for now, thank you for... Sorry, Elie?
Sorry. I was going to say, and unfortunately, we'll probably have to talk about guns again because we can't go 2 weeks without a mass shooting in this country. Again, thanks to people like Clarence Thomas and Brett Kavanaugh.
This is what's at stake, everybody. They say you can't have a voice. We should and must be able to have that voice. Thanks for watching. That's Justice Correspondent for The Nation, Elie Mystal. I'm Mike Sachs, a Senior Advisor with Court Accountability. Watch us next week, too.
Real quick, Meta just changed their algorithm to suppress political content. Please follow our Instagram at MeidasTouch right now as we head towards 400,000 followers so you don't miss a beat.